Okay, so hi, I'm Reka. As I said, I work at Transport for London, and I'm actually sort of going to talk about the non-policing and confidence side. So what confidence is for us from a sort of transport approach. And rather than like how everyone else is showing findings and the results of research, I'm sort of more asking questions and asking for sort of help and experience and what has been working for in confidence in policing and how maybe that could be applied to a transport network setting. So it'll be a little bit different in that sense, and I hope it's interesting. So a little bit about where I am and what I do and what the context is for this. So Transport for London is obviously this gigantic organization whose main objective is to keep people moving. So sort of safety and security and confidence is a minor part of that. The main goal is to get people from A to B that way. The team that I work in is the Enforcement and On-Streets Operations Directorate. And we sort of deal with surface transport and also with sort of more of the safety security topics. So we cover basically most things above ground. So buses, taxis, freight, cycling, walking, driving, that kind of stuff. And then the topic areas that we look into are sort of classed in this terms of the 6 C's. So I'm probably gonna have to cheat here. So crime, collisions, congestion, cycles was one of them, commercial for freight, and then basically one of the C's is confidence. And that's sort of my area of focus. So confidence for TFL, I think might be a little bit different than confidence in policing. So we're very customer oriented. So I know in previous talks we were talking about the many publics and how there's the confidence of people who never actually interact with the police. Whereas for us, the confidence is mainly of the customers who do take the network or travel on the transport network. And in that sense, they have actual personal experience with this thing that we're interested in their confidence in. Also, while we do have frontline staff, they all sort of have different tasks and things that they're meant to be doing. And they're mostly measured on this based on volume. So for example, we have revenue protection inspectors, who are the people who check your ticket. And they're measured on the number of penalty fares they issue or how many people they check, the number of appeals they get, that kind of thing. But they're also front-facing staff, so they interact with their customers every day, and they're not necessarily measured on the volume of, or on the quality of this interaction. So we know that how they interact with people has an effect on people's confidence and perception of the service, but we actually do not measure this in any way. So basically the main question that we're asking here is what are things that TFL can do given these resources to increase the customer's confidence in our service? And one of the issues with this is of course measurement. So earlier we heard as well that confidence is this broad term that has many constructs, many elements that make up confidence. And in terms of policing, basically I'm gathering from everything that I've heard is that it's a lot of trust, legitimacy, and all that in the people, so in the police and in the organization. Whereas for us, while we have this sort of people element, there's also this question of the infrastructure and the network and the transport system itself. So for example, in terms of reliability, we can also talk about reliability of service. So do the buses show up on time? Are they there when I'm expecting? Is the bus behaving like I would expect? Is the bus clean and friendly and comfortable? And these things, as well as sort of the people element of things. So I think that's one area where it poses sort of different challenges than policing would, I guess. So basically we have currently 2 sort of measures for confidence in place. So I'm going to just briefly talk about those and what they are. So the first one is the Attitudes to Safety Security Survey. And this is a survey that focuses most on people's sort of fear of crime, worry, perception of safety, those kinds of features of confidence. So it's been running for quite a long time. It's an annual survey and it's a telephone survey. So they call people at home and they ask, do you use a transport network, which in most cases in London is yes. And then ask them a couple of questions of their experience and their perception of safety and security and disorder and all of these related concepts while they're traveling. So before I started, my colleagues did some work with John Jackson at LSE looking into different measures of worry. And one of the things that came out of it is there's sort of two ideas of worry that you get by asking different questions. So one is asking a general question of generally thinking, how worried are you about crime? And you sort of tap into people's overall anxieties and sort of diffuse worry kind of things, which are potentially a bit less actionable. And the other question, or the other approach, is to focus on questions about frequency and intensity. So those ones ask, in the past 3 months, how many times were you actually felt worried? And in those moments, how worried did you feel? So it's kind of anchoring to specific experience. And those are sort of the elements that maybe could be more actionable in a sort of situational approach. So those are things that maybe you can do something about. So from this research, we also spoke about many publics earlier. So it's great, hitting all the points. We sort of came into grouping our public into 4 groups based on these different kind of measures. And that is basically what you answered in the general worry and what you answered in the actual experiences with things. And you get these 4 sort of general groups emerging. So there's people who are unworried, who they never experience worry, and they generally don't feel worried. Then there's sort of unexpressed fear of people who do have this incidence where they come across something that makes them worried. But generally, they're not actually anxious about it. It's just part of their everyday life and travel. Then there's anxious people who are the opposite. They don't actually experience anything that makes them feel anxious, but generally they're kind of worried about things. And then there's worried who have the general worry, but also the specific experiences. So all of these groups basically would require very different interventions. So somebody who is generally worried, but they don't have any experiences while traveling, we can't really target the experiences because they're not having that. So it's more like an overall idea, and maybe it's a more comms and marketing approach that could reassure people that crimes don't really happen that much on the network or that kind of stuff. Where somebody who has specific instances that make them worried, it's those instances that we should probably focus on in order to address their worry. So it's sort of paying tribute to the many publics and different groups approach. And then the other measurement we have, which is more global, so not just focused on safety and security, is the customer satisfaction survey. And it asks a whole range of questions. I'll give some examples in a bit. But also it's very spatially explicit. So we have a different customer satisfaction survey for each mode. So you could have one for the buses, but you also have one for the bus stations. And also of specific areas of interest. So for example, if anyone's been to Victoria Coach Station, that's an area of interest, so that has its very own customer satisfaction survey. So you get to be able to make sort of spatial comparisons that way. What is working in one area and not working in the other area? How are people perceiving different places and times? And also it covers places and people, so it asks in certain areas. So for example, on the bus, it will ask how friendly was the driver, how approachable was the driver. Yes, he's driving the bus, but also he's sort of the face interacting. But it doesn't cover the people, and I'll come on to this later, but it doesn't cover the sort of enforcement people, so ticket inspectors, that kind of stuff, but it covers people who you come across with each time you take transport network, so the driver and the places. And so for the various elements, I'm not gonna expect everyone to read all of this, but basically, you get a lot of various things that feed into sort of customer satisfaction. So you rate sort of the vehicle. You have things like the bus exterior, bus interior. Was it clean? Was it free from graffiti? These kinds of things. Then you have the journey. How long did you wait? How reliable was your journey time? Was the bus comfortable? Was there freedom from jolting? So all these sort of things that go into it. And a very small part of that is the safety and security. So you have other things like value for money. So for basically our confidence is this very broad kind of thing. But then you can also use these measures to then make comparisons between different modes. So for example, here there's the comparisons between the 3 types of buses. And I've removed the number, so you can't tell if people like route masters, double deckers, or single deckers the most. But we can now compare them and see how people's sort of confidence varies by type of bus, for example. So these are some interesting things that we can look into with this one. And also same for the bus stations. So you have these sort of larger bus stations, and then again, we ask people to evaluate how they feel in terms of safety and security, freedom from graffiti, from like cleanliness, information, all of these things that go into our global measure of how satisfied our customers are. So these are sort of the things that we do know, but sort of the focus, I guess, for my work here is the things that we don't know. So one of the things that I mentioned was that we don't actually know how well the enforcement staff do perform in terms of increasing confidence. So for example, how the Met Police have the user satisfaction survey, we don't have that kind of thing for example, for people who get penalty fares, and that kind of thing. So that would be something that would be interesting to measure or capture, and if there's any other way of doing that besides surveys, because earlier we heard criticism of surveys. What are some other ways of gathering this type of information? Is there anything that's already out there being used? And also, so TfL itself as the global sort of thing is very customer focused and customer oriented, but how can we be more customer oriented or sort of taking confidence into account in terms of our research and the enforcement side of things? And also one of the other things that I think has been a theme that's been coming up today is sort of what is working. So how do we know what works for the police, for example? How could that be translated into a transport environment? And then how can this knowledge then be shared? Is there some sort of platform for sharing these kinds of informations and adapting different interventions and knowing what works, those kinds of things? So these are things that we don't know that would be really great to get some input and interest on. And we're out of time. Okay, so
running out of time.
Cool. That's pretty much last slide. So things that we want to do, basically identify the drivers of confidence within the transport setting. So what I talked about, there's loads of things that feed into it. Find ways to measure how our frontline staff intervenes, and then find out what works. That's pretty much what I just said. So some things that we're trying to do moving forward is trying to take from the user satisfaction survey those instances that did happen on transport and see if there's sort of any difference between satisfaction with policing on transport versus off transport. And then also start looking at the different worry groups and what are some ways to interact with them differently, and also how to incorporate sort of feedback to people to increase confidence into business as usual. And that's it.
I did have the benefit of supervising Ben, so you can blame me for a lot of that. A couple of points I wanted to make was going to the threats to life issue. There's a number of areas of policing which of course are causing significant resource burdens, and where I think the practitioners are saying this doesn't really make sense to us, but it's the policy impact. And I think coming back to Tank's point, really, sometimes there's things that you do that you maybe can't put your finger on, but you know it has some value, and there may be that with threats to life, that visits and reassurance, it's difficult to measure, but maybe that's a side benefit of it, or maybe that's the purpose of it. But clearly, in terms of the amount of effort that goes into and how effective is it at preventing further harm to life, I think that's questionable, and the evidence there to support that policy would be quite weak. It's probably there because of the two stated cases that you mentioned, and you'd get into trouble if you didn't do it. So it becomes a very expensive and questionably unjustified way of responding to a couple of incidents a long time ago that might not be representative. And there's a lot of that in policing. And I think one benefit of the evidence-based approach is that we can now challenge some of those practices. Getting that through is another matter. The point I wanted to bring back about confidence was, I think the first bit, and speaking to the speakers before, talking about the speakers before lunch, confidence was multifaceted, variable, really complex, difficult, moving creature. And I think to some extent the presentations after lunch, we've actually then tried to define it. And I liked your comment at the start about trying to get the measures. Do we measure, is confidence important because we measure it, or is it because we measure it that it's important? But in effect, you define confidence as, we said we did, and it's about crime and antisocial behaviour. And then you define confidence through all your multiple tables and questionnaires. So in effect, we've come up with a definition. You've both come up with definitions of confidence. But is that confidence? And are we then stuck into trying to find measures for things that maybe they're not measuring? So maybe it comes back to your narrative question again. So it's whether it's a question or not, I don't know, but it feels as if we're forcing ourselves into try and find measures for things that can't be measured.
So I definitely agree with that. There's so many different definitions and that theirs might not be one. So I think it very much depends on the context. I mean, I think the three of us had three very different definitions for it because we're looking at three very different things. So for example, for the confidence of the public in the police, all the things that we've heard about what influences that is quite relevant. Whereas if you're asking like the confidence of the police in police, is a very different thing. So might be influenced by a lot more by personal experience and by the like systems in place for guidance and all of that. Whereas like customer confidence in the customers in transport is again a very, very different thing. So it might not really be influenced by sort of personal tendency to trust in authority or that kind of thing. It might just be influenced by, again, with experience with transport and with complete like cleanliness of environment and that kind of stuff that wouldn't, again, not be relevant in there. So I think it's very much defined for a purpose. And I agree that with the measure, we are sort of defining it by things we can measure, but I think that's very much because we're looking for actionable things. But I mean, I'd like to throw that back out as well of like, how do we then find out what we don't know? So how do we find out to measure the things that we're not measuring? And what are some recommendations for that? Because that would be really interesting, I think.
And I'm going to ask a question to Reka, which I did ask you at lunch, but I'm going to ask you now for the record because I think it needs to be asked. I was hearing last week, and then it was confirmed, well, not confirmed, but also asked again in the Evening Standard last week, that British Transport Police are about to close their sexual offences unit. Despite Project Guardian, despite all the rest of it. Now, I know this hasn't been confirmed fully, but, you know, it's in the Evening Standard, so people in London will have heard about it. Although apparently they're keeping their bike investigation unit open. And I'm just wondering how you think that might impact on the confidence in the policing of Transport for London, because clearly that's something you need to take into effect. Don't particularly expect you to give me an answer now, but it might be a question that you want to take back with you. Thank you.
Sure.
Whilst we're transferring, you can address that, Reka. Thank you.
Okay, sure. I mean, so while we work with BTP, they don't necessarily, so we work more with the Met Police because we are surface and BTP is more rail and underground. So personally for our team, sexual violence is a huge priority, and we are taking, so I'm actually doing some analysis with reporting and how underreporting and confidence are linked, and we're looking at underreporting of sexual violence or sort of sexual assault on transport. And we're looking to increase the reporting and how we can do that. So it remains a priority for us, for sure. And for us actually, so one of the C's used to be cycles, and that has been merged back into crime. So we're actually sort of moving the opposite direction. So we've merged cycles back into crime. But yeah, it remains a priority for that. I can't really comment on BTP, sorry.